The new Alcatel FM radio phone from GT&T.
Program which looks at issues of interest to you. Welcome to tonight's program with Dr. Grantley Warren.
This edition of Spotlight is set against the backdrop of our news organizations reporting that the tripartite consultative process will resume, and finally it appears as if the budget is going to be the area of focus. This decision by the government has ostensibly been occasioned, we have been told, perhaps by the fact that APNU has indicated that the budget will be headed for heavy waters because of a lack of consultation. Obviously, the lack of an authorized framework with which to spend the nation's resources to achieve its objectives must be a very undesirable state. Damned if you will. On tonight's Spotlight, amidst all of the confusion which obtains in this country with regard to where we are, where we're going, what roles are attributable to the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, and how these can be harmonized, if not reconciled. We have assembled two gentlemen who have made it their life's work to study these matters. We have with us Dr. Henry Jeffrey and of the University of Guyana, and Mr. Vincent Alexander, the Registrar of the University of Guyana. Gentlemen, welcome to Spotlight.
Thank you very much.
The focus of tonight's program is captioned, "Damned If You Don't," is not intended just to be an appealing caption, because the focus of this edition of Spotlight will be, in a certain sense, to try to remind us, to jog our sense of understanding, if not lack of will, to appreciating some of the areas which are clearly outstanding and which must be addressed if we are to attain the kinds of growth and development, and more importantly, state of social well-being as we hope for from day to day. In my introductory comments, I talked about and identified the question of consultation to avoid the state of being damned. Perhaps we may just want to start by asking the question, why is consultation necessary? Because the problem seems to be so intractable, and because it seems to be raising its head at every moment. I'm going to ask a very basic question. Why is consultation necessary, and why in particular, in the circumstances of a country such as Guyana, it's necessary?
Frankly, if one looks at the Constitution, I think the idea of consultation inheres in the Constitution itself. The drafters of the Constitution thought of a system that by its very nature would embrace consultation. So that's the legal perspective, the constitutional perspective. But beyond that, the way in which the Parliament itself is configured, if the Parliament is to meaningfully carry out its role, then again consultation becomes important, because you have a executive that's in the minority in the Parliament, and therefore the executive would have to have the cooperation, the collaboration of the opposition to take their program forward. So again, the very nature of the composition of the Parliament prescribes that there should be consultation.
Henry?
Well, that is true, in the sense that the government does not have the capacity to pass the legislation it wants, quite apart from that we live in modern times, and it speaks to the notion of consulting stakeholders. Democracy is broader than it is. It is not simply voting at election, not simply things like majority rule. It means that people who are going to be affected by any particular decision should be part of making that decision and indeed managing that decision. And I think most of that, at least the PPP at one time bought into. They wanted, for instance, if you're going to do construction projects, they wanted the people who are designing them to talk to the local communities. They wanted the local communities to get the result of that, to be able, first of all, to see if they agree, and then later to even monitor what's going on in the local communities. Whether or not that has occurred in the way they wanted it, at least this was an idealized way of looking at the world. So generally, today we live in the world of consultation, just even if it's to remove the notion of reduce the alienation that people feel that government is so far away from them and all of that. And up comes the other issue that here we have a situation that the government is not in control of the parliament and needs to move on. And therefore, like Obama in America, if you find yourself in that position, you have to go and talk to the other side. You have to make deals. You have to say, well, this is how we're going to move here. They're going to say, this is what I want. You'll say, this is what we prefer. They'll say, well, we won't support you on this unless you support us on that. And therefore, that's the kind of relationship that you need to have. So there again, you need consultation. It's more than consultation in deal making, because you are in no position to force your way through without a whole lot of problem. So it's gone beyond just consultation in the sense meaning that I need to speak to you and then you may or may not. Well, modern consultation also means you need to give reasons for not accepting my position and all of that. I think that Justice Bernard made that quite clear in one of the decisions she made in the court some time ago, that you need to give reasons for not accepting my position if we consult. But quite apart from that, it's more than that. You need to make deals, you need to negotiate now, because you don't have the power by yourself, you know, to do what you want to do. So it's gone beyond consultation.
You know, to my horror, I heard a senior political aspirant talk about having to consult in terms of subverting the intention of the electorate. If they won the plurality of the votes, therefore they get the executive, and the executive responsibility is to run the show. Your comments?
I grant you would take you back to Article 13 of the Constitution, which is very clear. And Article 13 predated the reform of the Constitution, but was retained by the reform. And it reads as follows. The principal objective of the political system of the state is to establish an inclusionary democracy by providing increasing opportunities for the participation of citizens and their organizations in the management and decision-making processes of the state, with particular emphasis on those areas of decision-making that directly affect their well-being. So under the principles and bases of the political, economic, and social system, our Constitution speaks directly to this question of inclusion, talking about an inclusionary democracy. And indeed, the Parliament provides a framework at that level of operation for inclusion. And one may well see the opposition parties as organizations that represent the people being involved in the management process. That apart, frankly, we live in the era of good governance. It's almost universally accepted that countries should operate in the framework of good governance. And in that context, consultation is one of the elements of good governance. So, in a sense, in terms of political practice, it's a best practice, really, to be involved in consultation.
Mm-hmm. Of course, I heard the leader of the AFC a couple of days ago indicating that the attempts now to have consultation, the resumption of the tripartite process to consult on the budget, which is due in literally in another month. He's just called it window dressing, optics, and propaganda. It has nothing to do with the substance of consultation. I just say that in passing. You care to make any comments on that?
Well, as I said, they've gone beyond consultation. You're using the wrong term. This is not a consultation process anymore. It's a negotiating one, because you don't have the power to do certain things you would normally have done if you had a majority. It's gone beyond that. It's now negotiation, so it's not consultation. And therefore, if you're going to negotiate, you have to, it depends on where you want to start. You've got to start very early on to determine what I want and what I don't want. I mean, the same thing goes for America. The truth with America is that Congress has a budget office that deals with the budget too. So before Obama turns up at this, they have their own notions of what will take place. And therefore the negotiation perhaps is easier. But my point is, it's not consultation anymore. The Constitution says we should consult, and that's fine. But we've gone beyond the Constitution because of what the electorate have said. And you're official or aspirant. I hope he remains or she remains an aspirant for the very reason that they don't understand what you're talking about. What are you subverting? You can't subvert what the electorate has said. It is not given the other side a majority. And therefore, they just can't do it. Even if you deny the general drift of what the Constitution says.
Mm-hmm.
I'll grant you this. I think there are 2 points I would like to make here. One is that, unfortunately, even before we got into this position of negotiation, as Henry refers to it, we didn't properly develop the culture of consultation. And I would say if we had developed the culture of consultation, even though we may have an opposition majority, if that spirit existed, then things could have been dealt with in the context of consultation rather than negotiation. So in fact, what is happening with us, we are being driven to a culture of consultation by virtue of the power play, where you have to negotiate, and the negotiation could be seen as a subset of the wider thing called consultation. The second point I therefore want to make is this, that very often politicians get involved with what they think is popular rhetoric. They say the things that are politically right. The advantage of that to the populace is that if you continue to say the right things over time, you're driven to do those things. And so I would think that what is happening is progressive insofar as we have articulated commitment that will over time drive us to behave in the manner in which we have articulated ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Of course, this evening we are looking at the issue of be damned if you don't. One of the issues I saw in an opinion piece, even as the Linden situation was described, it talked about the crisis at Linden being exacerbated by an unresponsiveness of the state apparatus to the issues at the moment. I wonder if we could examine that particular position. We have just talked about the consultation, now moved to negotiation, as Henry has identified it. But this question of unresponsiveness, because you can consult and you can negotiate, and if you're not responsive, I suspect there are some outcomes.
Well, the people of Linden and the persons who did the negotiations for Linden knew quite well, because Hoyt negotiated, Corbyn negotiated with government, and many of these things, they were not done. So they knew quite well the culture they were getting into. The people, at least the people who were doing the negotiating, that knowing that if you negotiate and you have an outcome, it's not necessary that people carry out those outcomes, or it's not necessary that we'll adjust what we have agreed to keep in tune with what the present condition exists. I mean, because when you negotiate, it might not be the same. So that's what you are facing again, that you have negotiated, but the outcome of those negotiations are not done in a timely fashion, at least not as timely as you had expected. The question of that, of course, is there are ways to go with that. There are ways, if you are powerful enough, you again used the power you had to get the person to implement, and that is one way. And if you have a proper agreement, the next way is to move to some level that would force the other side to negotiate. There's no other way. Because at the end of the day, even if you have an arbitration, and then the arbitrator come out with a decision, and the arbitrator says, Grantley Waldron, you were wrong, and you should compensate Henry Jeffrey by giving him your car, let's say. At the end of the day, if you say no, somebody got to force you to do it. And to the extent that there's no one to force you to do it, I mean, it's just a piece of paper. At the end of the day, that's what it boils down to all the time. So you can consult or you can negotiate on what you like. At the end of the day, you have to have some real power, and that power may well either exist in terms of you demonstrating again your capacity to do something, or go to the courts, and hopefully when the courts say X, do X, the regime or whosoever to do it, Grantley Waldron will do it. But only today I was reading some letter, I don't know if by Lincoln or Lincoln Lewis who's saying, look, in terms of labor, the court said to do something and nobody did it. And nothing is happening in terms of their dispute with the bauxite industry. So that's where you are.
This probably points to two things. It probably points to the fact that our democracy is not a matured democracy, because democracy essentially stands on three pillars. The electoral pillar, where the representatives are elected; the responsive pillar, where those who are in office are responsive to the people, not at elections, but in between elections. So in terms of their actions, they have to take cognizance of the views of the people and to be responsive to the people. And the fact that this is not what is happening suggests that our democracy is not a matured, a full-grown democracy, and that to a large extent when we hear the cry of a return to democracy, we are merely talking about elections, and we're not talking about the entire thing called democracy. The other aspect of democracy is responsible behavior, behavior within a context, behavior that is in keeping with the rule of law. So we do seem to have a problem of a democracy which has not yet matured, and therefore essential elements of the democracy are not being observed. And therefore, Henry's quite right, it still requires a tremendous struggle, using what power you have to drive the system to behave in a particular way, and hopefully when the system starts behaving that way, that behavior is routinized. So you don't have to remake the process every time you have a problem, that you routinize the system in such a way that it is responsive and it is responsible in its behavior. And that is what the struggle is going to be about. We're still in the stage of struggling. I think, though, that one has to ask certain questions. You know, the People's Progressive Party has continuously said to this nation that it believes in democratic centralism. Its Congress has refused to remove from that position. And one must accept that democratic centralism and liberal democracy are not the same. And so, though you have from time to time an articulation about democracy, the party has maintained that it is not a liberal democratic party and therefore will not conduct the affairs it's allowed to conduct in that manner. And so here's a part of the problem we have. An electorate that goes out there and in part supports a party that does not commit itself to liberal democracy.
Interesting view. Henry,
The PPP can run its party how it wants to run it, democratic centralism or whatsoever. But if the suggestion is that the PPP trying to run Ghana as a democratic centralist state, it certainly is in contradiction to the notion of the very notion of democracy that it is committed to. I don't think they should run their party according to democratic centralist mode. I think it's outmoded, it's nonsense, it's been discarded, it's maybe only us, even the Chinese don't bother with that anymore. But if they wish to. But when you come to the country itself, they are committed to open and fair elections. Vocalizing for us to vocalize what we're doing today and even more than this in terms of free media and all this thing. For us to be in an order, be with you today and agree and perhaps change our mind tomorrow and say we don't agree with you. These things are not easily done in a democratic centralist arrangement. And they are now committed to that. So I am not too concerned what they believe in the party. I mean, I would wish they were not, if they are. But I certainly don't think that is applicable to what exists in this state. And although the HPS at one time has spoken in terms of the forestry industry, in terms of some kind of democratic sense, I want to put that down to some kind of aberration of some sort, and not to any notion that you're going to run Guyana according to the democratic centralist framework.
You know, we have been regaled with a notion which seems to have gained currency in many multicultural societies, that ethnic and cultural diversity can be a strength. It can be a focal point around which much is brought out to the table, and the collective therefore benefits going forward. However, in a general sense, at the first hint of a show of disrespect within that multicultural whole, that means disrespect for one's cultural and or ethnic position, you could engage problems that you don't necessarily wish. One of the areas you are doomed to failure with if you do it. The 1823 monument debacle, and there has been so much said about this whole story. Today I passed by the site and I see work is feverishly going on in the building of a monument next to on the seawall. Do you think that perhaps we may be sowing the seeds of even greater discord? As one person puts it, this is an absolute act of disrespect for an ethno-cultural group.
I differ slightly with Henry on the question of the PPP and its operation at the national level, because I feel that in some regards their practice of and belief in democratic centralism transcends what happens in the party and becomes evident as what's happening at the level of the state. I think that is where the problem is. There's this notion they have that if they're elected, then they have the right to make the decisions. They are the government, and they do not see this thing of them being the government in the context of good governance that requires the government to consult and do all the other things to be transparent and to be open and ethical and all of those things that are associated with good governance. And I think that is where the problem in some regards reside. I think there may be some pathologies involved here that have to do with the history of the country and the way in which in the past, matters were conducted and the kind of fears and psyche that one brings to national politics. I don't think that the PPP has been able to unpsych itself from certain complexes that they have developed within themselves. And much of what they do is in response to those complexes in an attempt to protect their own interests. But the point of diversity is also a critical point, because in multicultural societies, different groups bring different values to the table. And the challenge really is, how do we resolve the question of what will be the accepted national values? And I think that is one of the questions that we are faced with. What will be the accepted national values in terms of how we conduct the affairs of the country? And we have not embraced the discussion and pretend that this is not a problem, and I think it is a problem. But that's a part of trying to establish national values where everybody agrees that this is the way we will conduct the affairs. This is separate from your substantive program, whether you want to build a school or a hospital. It's how you conduct national affairs. Separate and apart from us not concluding on that and not discussing that and then pretending that it's not a problem. I think that in a society that is as diverse as ours, one has to embrace a certain level of decentralization to facilitate that diversity. One has to recognize that people operate at various levels. They operate at the personal level. They operate at the community level. They operate at the national level. And you have to be able to disaggregate in the society the levels of operation and allow people at certain levels to be responsible for their own affairs. And in that regard, you're able to facilitate the diversity. So if you talk about the personal level, you're talking about things like marriage and things like those, which are personal things. And one group embraces different practices as opposed to another group. If you talk about the community level, you're talking about another level of engagement, probably engagement in cultural activities and things like those. And so what's important here is to be able to disaggregate the activities of the state, to facilitate people being in control of their own affairs at a level where they can be free to practice what is peculiar to them without interfering with the national good. And so the level of the national good, you determine what values must be applied so that there is no contradiction between what's happening at the lower levels and what's happening at the top. And the top facilitates what's happening at the lower levels, but does not allow dominance of one group or culture over the other at the national level.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you what, Henry, you're going to frame a response and come immediately after we take a break and recognize our responses. And no doubt you may want to just very succinctly close off the discussion on the question of, because I see the point of departure that Vincent takes from it. It's not necessarily different from the position that you're taking. It just takes a different twist on saying that in fact he observes that the portent to democratic centralism, which is part and parcel of the party decision-making apparatus, is very much a part of its attempt at conducting business at the national level. But I thought I heard you to be saying that it's not appropriate more than anything else, rather than saying that they are not trying that. But you can, of course, very quickly try and deal with that. But then, of course, the issue of the multicultural considerations will be the substantive item you'll take up immediately after the break. We'll take a break at this time.
Alcatel FM radio phone from GT&T.
Yes, Henry, please.
Well, democratic centralism in no way precludes consultation. Indeed, properly done, it means that you should consult and continue consulting. Democratic centralism is essentially made a way of doing the elections in any organization and the way in which decisions are made in the organization. But it doesn't preclude anybody from consulting. It essentially says that the lower part of the organization is bound by the decision of the higher organs in the organization once it has been given the opportunity to first of all voice its opinion, and those higher organs have taken a decision. And as such, I don't believe, I think that in terms of the state as such, it doesn't stop you from consulting. And what is essentially stopping or preventing this government from consulting, I don't think has anything to do with the structure of government. If you were in Britain and you won the elections, and you would think that you have the right to rule too and go on ruling. It doesn't mean that the parliament in Britain is not framed in a way that allows all sort of participation and so on. But the British Prime Minister today considered something of president in his own right, that they go on and do, they believe that if I win, they will want to rule. The truth is, and this brings me into your multicultural society discourse, is that we don't live in that kind of, more or less, if you wish to call it. So it's not a racially unitary society, but more as dominant racial society. So we get to, we have to behave a bit differently, and we have to take into consideration the racial balances in the society. Even in England they do that. You will find very so often, or in this kind of parliamentary system they do it, that you will have all kinds of Afro-Guyanese and Indians being brought into the seats of government. That's largely because it's necessary. Baroness Amos, for instance, our own, brought into government. And so this is largely to give some sort of solace to the very minority, but certainly an important part of British society. And so on. And not only her, but many others that have been brought there to do that kind of a thing. So consultation to me doesn't, democratic centralism don't preclude it. There are other things precluding consultations here, and perhaps we'll get to that before the end of the day. In terms of actually the cultural problem you face, I think that you call it disrespect. I don't know what to call it myself. I think that the PPP I wrote something on this, and my own view is that they don't like the idea of the parade ground or Independence Park, largely because it carries too many negatives to the PPP. It carries the negative one, that the PNC has always been there stirring up things in the playground, more or less, for the PNC. It carries, imagine you call a meeting in this context that we have, a political context that we have here, and you call a meeting there, you can bring up all the imagery of what has happened here, of our brothers and sisters have been killed here, murdered here, fighting for independence and all this sort of thing. The imagery would be very, very powerful. The other side that they have there doesn't carry that kind of imagery. You can, and I also believe that when you do that in that part of Georgetown, as a matter of fact. You cannot curtail it easily. I actually do believe that a site is useful, the army's next door and all of that. And, you know, you ain't going to go there and hold any big meeting in any sensible way, and it cannot be controlled. So I believe all of these things have led them to do that. My own feeling, though, is that it is not a sensible thing, largely because if they create a monument there, I think it's be creating a monument to their own overall destruction. People will be passing there with their children, and particularly Afro-Guyanese, and telling them that that's not there, and they'll give them a totally different story of why the PPP has created that monument there. And particularly if the other side say they're going to go and create a monument somewhere else, and holding meetings at that place. Even if they can't create a monument, they might just go and hold meeting there, put an artificial monument and say, this is our monument, because, oh no, you're creating too much confusion in this society to allow that to happen. And that's why I think that the government is wrong-headed in attempting to go ahead with that monument.
Mm-hmm. Vincent, you're... Yes, okay. Now, cries of marginalization and disenfranchisement. I mean, hearing these things year on end, whether it was in the days of the PNC running this country and now the PPP running the government. The other group is marginalized, is disenfranchised, and nobody can tell them differently coming from any other group. However, in a certain sense, I saw this reduced to a sense of a difference in one's perspective of an equality of entitlement in and before the state. Different sense of justice, entitlement and justice. Vincent?
I think the venerable and respected Cheddi Jagan has to take some responsibility for where we're at. When one talks about the state normally, one would talk about three centers of power: the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. Cheddi introduced the idea of the administration being a center of power. Administration meaning the arm of the government that actually delivers the goods and services, not the ministers and the cabinet, which directs, but the actual arm of government that delivers the goods and services. And he talked about the PPP not having administrative power. And what we have seen as a consequence of the attempt to acquire administrative power is to put people of like mind into administrative positions. And unfortunately, in the context of Guyana, they're not only people of like mind, but they're people of like ethnicity. So we've seen in the public sector, or in the public service, to a very large extent, a proliferation of Indo-Guyanese in offices that were previously held by Afro-Guyanese, and all sorts of maneuvers to make that possible. For example, when you talk about Guy Mida, the way in which Guy Mida was closed and reopened, and what really, the real difference that the closing and reopening facilitated was to change the leadership, you know, so that we've arrived at a situation where, in fact, African Guyanese with some legitimacy can claim that they are marginalized, can claim they're discriminated against, because they are obviously not seriously considered for positions in the administration, because one of the objectives of the government, the PPP, is to seek administrative power. And this is evident, very much evident in the state sector, be it in Gaisuco. Cheddi used to argue about the proliferation of Afro-Guyanese in Gaisuco, but the proportionality now there's no comparison. There were proportionality previously allowed for many more Indo-Guyanese than it allows for Afro-Guyanese at this point in time. So this question of the pursuit of administrative power has created major problems. And again, this pursuit of administrative power is something where we have not attempted to put on the agenda what we think are national problems and to come up with national solutions, but to impose a one-sided solution to the problem. This issue was one which was raised in the constitutional talks. This issue was one that led to the establishment of the office of the Ombudsman. So even before independence, there was some recognition that there were some imbalances that need to be addressed and things like that. But to come and to attempt to address them in a partisan manner certainly will result in a standoff between the two major ethnic groups.
Yes, I think that, yes, the latter part there, Vincent recognizes that this whole question of imbalance was always there, and for most part, most people, the public service, the security forces, people have always been talking about rectifying this imbalance and doing something about it. And yeah, so I am not certain that I will say that. Well, put that blame particularly on Cheddi Jagan. It was there. Everybody was saying they wanted to do it. There was a commission, I think, that came down here sometime and talked about this imbalance. That's since the 60s, and said that this balance must be dealt with and all of that. I wouldn't lay that blame there. What I laid, where I perhaps laid the blame on the PPP is for overstepping the bounds of that imbalance, and secondly, not recognize that the imbalances exist elsewhere. Imbalances exist in the business service. I've written that in business. If you only got to pick up the telephone book, I've always said, and see who own all the businesses. Certainly the government can do something about a situation like that. In America, they do things about that. I've written some time ago that these things can be dealt with. You just can't sit down and say, oh, well, the black people are more or less, they have an acumen and a propensity to want to go in the public service, but we need to balance that. Indians have a propensity to go in business, but we're not going to worry that because there's a private enterprise business. No, a society don't run like that. You need balances throughout the society. And you have to try and create those balances if you were a proper government. You just don't sit down and leave it as it is on one side and try to balance on the other side. So that makes no sense whatsoever. Thirdly, I actually believe that under Cheddi Jagan, we did pass the discrimination in employment legislation. That thing needs some, has never been put in force. I mean, America has it, all sort of places have it. You need to put in place the orders and so on. That would even, that you will set criteria by which people must employ, speak to the nature of employment, and this goes for all sectors of the economy, not only the public sector. So that is left there without, and that was done, this is 1997, and the Discrimination of Employment Act has been on the board, but the proper way of doing this has never been done.
You see, the reason why I blame Cheddi, I recognize, as Jeffrey himself recognized of me, that this problem has persisted over time. The reason why I blame him because of how he contextualized the problem. He didn't contextualize the problem as one of equal opportunity, one of balance in terms of occupation and things like that. He contextualized the problem as administrative power. So he made it a problem that was annexed to political control. And there is where I think he went wrong, and we are still reeling from that.
Yeah. At the same time, I suspect that we will recognize that the servicing of the bureaucracy requires a highly trained and motivated people who thrive best in an atmosphere of stability, predictability, and mobility. Now, have the choices made with contract workers, even at very low levels of employ, not undermined this whole notion of the creation of a bureaucracy that can service our state apparatus?
Grant, the fundamental principle of bureaucratic operations, meritocracy, that people must merit. And if you're going to depart from that, then, as I said earlier, you have to articulate what the problem is and why you are doing something other than what inheres in bureaucratic arrangements. And that is what has not happened here. If you were to check the certain jobs in this country and the traditional qualifications for those jobs, what the contract worker has done is to undermine the positive elements of bureaucratic arrangements. And so there's no guarantee that people will essentially get jobs because of their qualification and based on a known set of criteria and things like that. Contract workers allows for a lot of arbitrary and capricious decision making, and is a mechanism to achieve the administrative power that Chetty Jagan talked about.
Henry?
Contract workers do more than that. It undermines the entire process by which the bureaucracy is supposed to work. One of the things I found when I was in government, as Hoyt had written a document, Desmond Hoyt had put out a document about the powers of ministers and the powers of permanent secretaries, a clear stated document that a minister can't direct a permanent secretary to do certain things, to spend in ways that are illegal. Today we see the APNU trying to pass bill, saying to trying to get the minister involved, the minister in the decision, largely because the view is that the minister can tell the permanent secretary to do things, and because he's on contract, he will do it because he, even his gratuity is beholden on whether or not he operates in a given kind of a way. Therefore, when you put people on contract, then it undermines more than simply a will to take over the administration, because you could have done that by putting the right people in the Public Service Commission, and there is always the old question of who is merited something from who is not, and maybe you can find all that sort of argument. But effectively, that's how it undermines the public service, because it makes people not wanting to do what I'll call a professional job. They will be worried about what will be the outcome of any decision they make in terms of their long-term or medium-term future.
Yeah, we can't do a program of this kind without flogging what may probably be the most beaten horse that there has been in these discussions. And that is this whole question of our constitutional construct, where we have in our electoral, as a consequence of the electoral format, allowed the plurality of the votes to cede executive right to a group, notwithstanding what the majority position is. I mean, by almost definition, if you don't get if you have a plurality in under 50, then you do not have the majority. But yet, so much of what we have seen in terms of the powers of the executive, the almost quote unquote, some things that I prefer to call the operations of practical politics, not to mention the question of those areas in law which seem to imbue the executive with a substantial amount of autonomy, if not almost dictatorial powers. Could you talk to this particular issue? We can't not treat this issue.
I think one of the problems we've been faced with as a nation is in our attempt to be creative and different. We have ended up in very many instances with hybrids that have thrown up a lot of anomalies that we've not been able to work with. So, for example, in Guyana, we are associated with the Westminster system, but at the same time we have a presidential system. And So you have a hybrid of Westminster and presidential. And what you do, you use your election to deal with both at the same time. So your election does what elections do in other places, determine the president. And in most countries, the question of the president is one of plurality. But it's the same election you use to determine the parliament. And you tie the two. And so I think that what is required of us is some engineering to undo some of the problems we've created for ourselves, particularly given the political culture that prevails. If the political culture was different, the system probably could work differently. But the Constitution is not geared to curtail the political culture that we have. And in that context, we probably need to change one of two. Either the culture, and that's a more difficult one to change, or the Constitution.
Let me say this too. I think because you gotta be a bit historical here, in the sense it's Forbes Burnham put that thing there. Mm-hmm. The PNC had the opportunity in 2001 to change it. They did not. They did not do so. They didn't. To be truthful, I can't even remember that there was a massive discourse about changing this. I can't remember any massive discourse about changing this. Mr. Burnham put it there largely because I believe that he felt that maybe you can't always rig election over the 51%, but you can perhaps rig it up to 40 and say the PPP only got 38. So effectively he'll still be president, and then it might draw everybody into some sort of government or whatsoever. But the point is, 2001 we had constitutional changes. You have the Constitution, I think that is the day. And nobody, I don't know if you can remember this great debate about this issue. It never.
There were many of us in many organizations who were quite upset that it didn't go far enough. It was just tinkered with.
Exactly. So it is. It was left there by everyone, and the result is that you have what you have. Indeed, the PPP is only holding on to that little piece of thing. I mean, and that's another discourse altogether. But all the PPP had, their electoral base has shrunk. He spoke up to administrative power and all of that, Vincent, but what that in case is all the military and all that. That has never been there. And there was only one little thing that's keeping them in office. This notion that the Constitution says that a government can be formed by the party that does not have the majority, and perhaps doesn't have to take much cognizance of the people who are the majority. That's what keeps them there.
Hell of a dilemma, hell of a dilemma. What minimum steps you think need to be engaged? Because that one, more than anything else, I think can help set the framework and lead the way. In particular, when you take recognition of the fact that nobody votes himself out of office. And in a certain sense, that is what we have.
I would say that at the end of the day, our biggest problem is our political culture. It's not a problem at the level of the national government. It's a problem at almost every level. Whether it's a cricket club, the cricket board, the football federation, they're all steep in a political culture, and that is to some extent undemocratic and does not embrace the principles of good governance. And I think that is where we have to go in terms of change. It will take a new generation.
Well, that's my problem with what Vincent is saying.
Yes, I mean, I'm listening to him and I'm saying, you mean I have to get grayer than I currently
am? No, you have to die.
I gotta die. I
see. No, that's my problem. This is not.
No. Did you mean DYE or DIE? All right.
No, both. The truth is that I don't think so. I think it's a structure of governance. It's just what you just mentioned just now, the way we structure government. And that will change the political culture as we go along. We can't wait for man to become good, for politicians to become good, for us to love each other, for us to proceed in a given way. We have to change the structure, and it is that practice that would make us good as we proceed.
What motivates the body politic as it is currently constituted to move to the point where it should want to change?
I think you're asking the wrong question. You have to ask, first of all, where is the body politic at this point of time? And I think myself, that's for a whole lot of discussion.
What we will do is that we will take that as the cue on this issue of Spotlight for the next discussion which we need to have. To ask the right question, where is the body politic at this time in relation to the choices which must be made to ensure that there is some light in all of this darkness which seems to have encompassed us. Let me therefore thank Dr. Henry Jeffrey and Mr. Vincent Alexander for stimulating much discourse, in as much as we have, in some circumstances, attempted to flog an old horse. I saw elements of a different whip, and I think we are all indebted to your perspectives on these issues. I'm Grant Lee Waldron, therefore saying good night from Spotlight.
The new Alcatel FM radio phone from GT&T.